991, on the east coast of England, Vikings warred against Saxon in a battle for the future of that island country. Now, what happens next will shock you. Actually, it probably won't shock you. The Vikings won, and the Saxons were routed. Now, this battle might have been forgotten, but the widow of Berknock, the Saxon leader, may have been the one who commissioned a poem commemorating the event and her husband's involvement with it. Now, while we only have a fragment of the poem, that fragment has survived for close to 1,000 years and has made the Battle of Maldon a little more personal and made us feel a little more connected to it. Now, I'm Amy Bright, and today I'm going to be talking about the historical context of this battle. And then on Thursday, around the same time, I'm going to talk about the poem itself. Now, I want to talk about historical context when it comes to this kind of time period. The information that we have is conflicting, incomplete, inconsistent, and intentionally biased. Now, this should sound familiar, but we also have a lot less from that time period than maybe we do now. So just know that. I recognize it, and if I miss out on something, if you're listening and this is your jam, and you hear something that's just wrong or there's been newer discoveries that I've missed, I want you to let me know in the comments. It's going to help me to adjust what I teach, but I ask that you be kind. A very delicate constitution. But let's get back to that backstory. So in the late 700s, the Vikings, also known as the Danes and the Northmen, began to raid the island now known as England in earnest. And in fact, they kept a swath of land in England under their control, and it was known as the Danelaw. Now, almost 100 years after this, King Alfred the Great, who was a Saxon king, resisted the Vikings to the extent that he conquered back the Danelaw and led to some semblance of peace. Now, at all times, there's fighting going on in this island, so peace is relative. Then, Alfred's grandson, Athelstan, ran out even more Vikings, and then he became the king of all of England. So in 927, that's about the year that what we consider England now popped into existence. Now, life seemed a little more decent, at least for that time, but in 978, King Edward, who was one of many King Edwards, was murdered, and his 10-year-old son Athelred became king. Now, instability, young, inexperienced leadership, this combined made it a perfect time for the Vikings to resume their raiding, and they seized that opportunity. And they raided consistently. Now, sometimes they raided, and they slaughtered people and they took their stuff. But sometimes it was just enough to threaten a raid, and then the English would pay them off, and they would go away for a little while, and then they'd come back because it was a good source of steady income. So it was basically a giant protection racket, but there was no protection part, really. Now, in 991, the Vikings attacked Thames, Ipswich, Sandwich, a couple of other places all up and down the coast. And then they turned their attention to that Maldon area on the east coast. Now, these numbers and this information is from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, so a little iffy. But in this case, the Vikings who attacked Maldon were said to be led by Olaf Tryggvason and 93 ships. Now, the details of the attack are actually in the poem. A lot of the real specific stuff we get from there and from a few other sources. So we're going to really discuss like what happened on Thursday, or at least what the poem says happened. But here are kind of your basics. So there was a Saxon, East Saxon man, he was Berknock, and he called up his fyrd, his men, kind of a militia, to withstand the Vikings. And they were on the coast, River Blackwater, and the Vikings were actually on an island. Now, whether through desertion, a lack of training, overwhelm, things falling apart, the Vikings, or the slaughter wolves, according to the poem, they killed Berknock and they routed the Saxons. And you get some different ones where maybe the Saxons killed so many of the Vikings limped back, back home to their ships, or not. But the Vikings won. Now that's not in the poem. That's later on in the historical record. Now the poem, like I said, is cut off before that final blow. But the Viking raid nets them thousands of now pounds, and then we have some record that Olaf returns 3 years later with Sven Forkbeard, who's the king of Denmark, to attack London and create tons of chaos kind of inland and extort even more money. And at this time, impels Ethelred to sue for peace. Now, some of this history is a little shaky. It could be conflated. Maybe one was one battle and one wasn't the other. We're not, there's some inconsistency there. But I did want to bring up the Sven Forkbeard because that is such an awesome name. Now, that's the historical context of the poem. You have instability, the frustration with the years of these raids. It's draining the local coffers, the frustration with building things up only to have it taken away from them. And then you also have the idea of your locals taking on these well-trained warriors to actually come in and try to protect themselves. Now, it's not to say that the Saxons weren't trained, but again, they were living at home. It's the Vikings who were coming in, and that's their job, to go out pillaging and raiding. So that's the context for this poem. And why am I even teaching about this? Well, part of it is this is just a fascinating time period for me. Contextually, you have some connection to Beowulf, but I'm also running a creative writing camp in August, and it's primarily for homeschoolers based on the time frame that it is. But it's going to be looking at the Battle of Maldon, the poem, and we're going to be looking at a spear fighting scene in there and learning spear fighting and then choreographing that spear fight in class so that students can start to see how something from the past can really is relevant to us now, and how we can learn how other people put together battle scenes so that when we write our own, it can be fantasy, it can be something that's more on the medieval end of things, Renaissance, anything with swords, spears, that sort of stuff, how we can take that and translate it into our own work and transform our own work through an understanding of combat. And it's also just a really interesting look, that poem is, at the mindset, well, we believe is, anyway, the mindset of the warriors who are facing this seemingly superior force, at least in terms of training. So I invite anyone to come back on Thursday where we actually talk about the poem, and we talk about fights and the set speeches and the idea of bravery in the face of overwhelming odds. And also, if you have a teenager or know of a teenager, 12 on up, who is really interested in writing, wants to create their own works of literature, to check out the camp. It's going to be a lot of fun. They're going to learn spear fighting. That's what you want for your teens. They're going to learn some short sword and how to take the information and that field and put it into their own writing. So check it out, and I will talk to all of you on Thursday.